Here is a green ink by Sailor, Studio 960. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook. A beautiful darker green that has a kind of brightness to it. Odd, I know to say that, but it's there. As a tone of green, I really like the darker tone here. So yes, there is some tone variation by pen, but only in extremely drier pens, like a drier fine, but even then it's slightly. Generally, a very predictable tone and its behavior with only the slightest hint of shading. So you need to choose this for the tone and not shading. I have come to expect much more shading from green inks, and so this can seem a bit disappointing to me, but the great solid tone does make up for it, making this a very, very interesting ink. The pen for today is a Sailor Riello. All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the extra fine nib, we get a nice mid-tone of green here with no feather, no spread. We do get some light shading that goes on in that we see a few darker letters show up, and the occasional darker word like the on the third line is darker than what's around it, where water, the T and the R are much darker than the rest of the word. Strangely, the on the second line is much darker than now directly beneath it, where they goes lighter to darker and looks very nice. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the extra fine. It has no feather, no spread. It does shade in, you can see it, it's very slight width on the first line, starts a little lighter and works its way darker. Same happens with there, right next to it. Underneath it, more does the same thing. Same with Adventure. So there is the tiniest bit of shading going on, though it's not like it's standout in what it's doing, but it does look nice on the page. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. There's no feather, no spread, there's nothing for shading. I mean, I'm moving it around to take a look, and it's just really a very straightforward tone here. I could possibly point to a couple darker areas, but they're not really standing out to me. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Really, there's not any difference I'm seeing here at all. No feather, no spread. The same little bits of shading do show up in some of this. You see it in paths on the third line. You see it in cheats on the third line and deception on the fourth. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the extra fine. The same exact tone that we got on the Clairfontaine. No feather, no spread. It is still shading, not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but that shouldn't be a shock. But it is shading. You see it in most on the second line. You see it in passes on the third and on the second line. Generally, there's a little bit of shade, but it goes from a darker mid-tone to its darker tone most of the time. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone that we got with the medium, the same tone as on the Clairfontaine. We get no feather, no spread, and we do get shading, which we did not get on the Clairefontaine. You really see it in dreadful. You see it in the and dwarves and every word has a little bit of shading coming through with it, which is always nice to have in your writing. It really does help give it a bit more character. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a tad bit darker and I want to say more vibrant than it was on the Clairefontaine. I was expecting some tone shift based on this paper, just on my experiences with different tone papers. This looks very nice. It looked good before. It looks really nice now as far as the extra fine goes. No feather, no spread, but there's only a few moments of shading that happen. Now, the on the first line is much darker, and Gandalf on the second line has a little shading, so does Took right next to it. But for the most part, what we're getting is fairly a uniform tone. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the extra fine, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine, a little brighter as a green as well. No feather, no spread, no shading at all. I think the tone that we're getting on this page does make it perfectly usable here, where you're not really feeling like you're losing out for using this ink on this paper. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. It is a little lighter and a little brighter than it was on the Clairefontaine, just as it did with the medium. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get some shading, yes, but not like it's shading the way, you would kind of hope from a stub. It's got some darker spots, but largely we're getting that uniform tone where the absorbency of the paper is really using up the shading that the ink would have. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, we get the same tone as Clairefontaine with no feather, no spread. It does shade, but it does not shade as much as it did on the Clairefontaine. Not that it did it a ton there, but it was very present. It sounds completely opposite. It's not a ton there, but it was present in more or less each word, at least giving a letter. Here, it doesn't show up as frequently, but when it does, it shows up the same way. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the extra fine. The same tone as the Clairefontaine, with no feather, with no spread, with almost no shading. If I were looking at this just on here and had not seen it on the Clairefontaine, I might think that this ink doesn't shade, yet it really does. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairefontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with no shading, and again, it would lead me to be a little disappointed with this ink if this was the paper I was really using it on all the time, because I do know that it can do much better. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diamine Evergreen. Here is KWZ Iron Gall Green number 1. Here is Levenger Gemstone Green. Here is Pen BBS number 219. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is right about the same tone, yet a little bit flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feather, no spread, no shading. It reads very easily on the page. It looks nice on this page. The slight off-white of the paper I still think has this ink looking very nice. And the thing that I really do notice is how the lines of the quad rule don't break this ink up at all, showing how opaque it is. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine. It is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, noticeably lighter, with no feather, no spread, no shading. This still could be used with no problem at all in note-taking. I would like it to be a bit darker here because I think in its darker tone it really does have something very nice about it. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a hair darker than it was with the medium, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feather, no spread, no shading, just a solid performing green ink the whole way. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. While it's nice to see inks in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements this color on the page. Here is an orange ink by Organic Studios F. Scott Fitzgerald Golden Orange. Here is a purple ink by Diatramentis Thomas Alva Edison Black Red. Here is a black ink by Noodler's Dark Matter. Here is a red ink by Sailor Fire Red. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathers. We get a little bit of spread, almost up to a medium. We get no shading. I don't think this is too bad looking at this on the paper. I think you're spending a lot of money writing on copy paper if that's what you choose to do. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little darker than it was with the extra fine, just about as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather fairly consistently. Almost every word has feathering really all over it, and that's coming with spread the entire time. Now, the feather and the spread are not something that would stop most people from really using this ink on this paper. It's not shading. I don't think it looks horrible if this is what you really choose to write on. I just would not choose this. Looking at the stub nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the medium, a little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather more than it did with the medium nib. It does spread more than it did with the medium nib. It does not shade at all, and I mean, you could, if you really wanted to force using it. I think if you use the stub here, you're really kind of ruining some of the experience for yourself. Looking at the back of the page, you see that there's a couple spots on the stub that it bled through and touched the page underneath. Same with the extra fine, though those spots aren't huge and horrible to stop you from using this ink on this paper. Seeing the back of the page, we see that there's a lot of ghosting, which means you couldn't write on both sides of the paper.
So what nib and pen do I...
This is very consistent as a color, almost to the point of being boring, where boring is beautiful, but this just missed it because of that extra fine. So I go for any medium to wet flow pen, regardless of its nib size. I just don't want the lighter tone, but I do think a dry fine will or dry medium will bring out a bit more of the shading. For me, when I'm looking at this ink, though, I don't think it's so much about the shading as the beautiful dark tone that we get from those medium to wet pens.
This is the end, and thanks for watching.